rate and respiratory rate begin to increase, and blood is sent to your extremities, and you're prepared for an emergency situation. Now you're ready to either fight or run. So it's all great. The problem is that if you're confronting the same person in your life, you're going to the same job and you're seeing the same coworker that pushes the same emotional button, that in time then you're subconsciously or unconsciously knocking your brain and body out of balance. And the long-term effects then begin to create disease. If you think about it, if you're getting a rush of energy, a rush of adrenaline, it's like a triple cappuccino. All of a sudden you get this heightened sense of awareness. The brain and the body wake up momentarily. Now, that only should last for about 90 seconds to 2 minutes. And I tell my children all the time, if you're angry for more than 2 minutes, you're faking it. In other words, when the stress response happens, we should be able to control it. A good example of an addiction is something you can't stop. So if you were in the midst of, say, an angry reaction to something in your life, and I came up to you and I said, Lisa, listen, I know you're angry, but why don't you just stop right now? Most people would say, are you kidding me?
Right.
It's because of this situation and this person. And I'd say, yeah, I know, but just stop that. So if you're unable to stop the emotional reaction, then that's a definition of an addiction. So these chemicals really are highly charged energetic signatures, and they create the emotional states of anger and aggression and hatred and judgment and fear and anxiety and hopelessness and powerlessness and depression. Those chemicals knock the body out of balance, and we begin to call those altered states of consciousness normal states of consciousness. And in fact, they're really causing us to live as primitive human beings. As the emotion begins to run, the chemicals that run through the body begin to signal the very thoughts that we think. And when we're in the midst of an emotional reaction to something or someone in our life, there's always a gap between the way things appear and the way things really are. The chemicals alter our perception, and if we react during the refractory period of those chemicals, we'll always say, I should have never said that. I should have never thought that. I should have never done that. There's nothing wrong with having an emotional reaction. The question is how long the refractory period of chemicals run. And if you keep an emotional reaction running for hours or days, that's called a mood. And if you ask a person, why are you in this mood? They'll tell you because something happened 10 days ago. And if you keep that refractory period going for weeks or months, that's called a temperament. And you'd say, why do you have such an angry temperament? And that person would say, something happened to me 10 months ago. And if you keep the refractory period going for years on end, that's called a personality trait. And so if we wanted to change some aspect of our personality, we have to look at the emotions layer by layer that we memorize that's become part of our identity. And if emotions are the record of the past, and you're living by the same emotion every day, then you're living in the past, and your body, as the unconscious mind, is believing that it's in the same circumstances 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, and that body can't take the redundancy of those chemicals, and that's when it begins to break down. It's like being in the presence of a lion, in the same cage with a lion all day long. So emotional intelligence, then, is learning how to shorten that refractory period. And as you begin to shorten that refractory period, it doesn't create your identity. You get to say, just like a child, you move through the emotion, you get rid of it, and it doesn't filter your perception for the rest of your day or for the rest of your life. If you have good habits and you have things about yourself that you like and you do certain things that you have become skilled at, well, that's a good hardwired pattern that you want to maintain. But if you have some habits that are self-destructive or self-limiting, those are fired and wired by your own volition. Now, the principle says that if you stop thinking, acting, and feeling the same way, the nerve cells that no longer fire together no longer wire together. As you stop communicating neurologically, just like any relationship, you begin to break apart those connections. So every time you learn something new, you make a new synaptic connection in your brain. So as you pay attention and you begin to become present in the moment, your brain literally upscales its hardware to reflect a new level of mind. It's amazing because we reach a certain point in our life, I think, where we stop learning and we start feeling. And when we do that, we trade off our own personal evolution. We get to a point in our life where we pretty much can predict the feeling of anything. You get to be about 35 or 40 years old. Psychology tells us that the personality is usually complete at that point, and in some degree it's true. And so people experience relationships, they experience sexuality, they experience their their successes and their failures, their importance and their unworthiness and their guilt, and they pretty much experience much of what life has to offer. So when you can predict the feeling of anything, well, how can anything new show up in your life? Because by very definition, you're forecasting your future based on your past. When we reach this point where we're using feelings as a barometer to determine life, we'll always miss adventure, we'll always miss opportunities. So when we begin to continue to learn, continue to evolve our actions, continue to experience new things, continue to step outside the box and try something else out, you're going to shake up neurologically your own substructures in your brain.
I love that. I love that.
So, the key element to change is then to be greater than your environment, to be greater than your body, and to be greater than time. And when we get about the business of change, we're always, interacting with the same people and doing the same things and going to the same places. And it's the environment, our external world, that's controlling how we think and feel.
Our patterns, right?
The moment we begin to react in the same way to the same conditions in our life, then we begin to cause different circuits in our brain to turn on equal to everything that we know in our life. And that repetition over time begins to hardwire our brain to everything familiar in our life. You wake up in the morning, you go to work the same way, you see the same people that push the same emotional buttons, you get at your desk and you do the things that you know how to do so well. You drink coffee out of your favorite mug, you complain to the same people in the same way that stir up the same emotions. You see the same people that push the same emotional buttons with you. And then as in time, we could say that the environment really is shaping and molding how we think and feel. So to change then is to be greater than the environment, to begin to act and think and feel differently than our present circumstances. And there's a concept in neuroscience called neuroplasticity. And plasticity tells us that we're changed by every thought we think, every new experience we have, every different choice we make, every new dream that we fabricate. The brain literally reorganizes itself to reflect a new level of mind, which begs the question, I think, that most people really are thinking the same way every day, acting the same way, and feeling the same way, but really hoping something will show up differently in their life, and it never does. So, hardwiring our brain over time to the same conditions in our life then causes us to think equal to everything we know. And if we believe in any way that our thoughts have something to do with our destiny, then as long as we're reacting to everything we know in our life, we keep creating more of the same. And as long as you're evolving your actions and modifying your behaviors to do a better job in life, your brain literally installs new circuitry to reflect your own evolution. Well, I think, most people really wait for trauma or crisis or loss or disease, tragedy in some way, and when they get to that point where we reach our lowest denominator, that's when we begin to examine ourselves. And that concept in neuroscience is called metacognition. And metacognition says that we can pay attention to how we think, we can notice how we feel, we can, become aware of how we act, so that those are in place so we can modify our behaviors to begin to produce different outcomes. So plasticity gives us that permission to do it. But once again, though, biology then is a direct result of consciousness. So if you keep everything the same, then your biology stays the same, and now you're headed for your genetic destiny. And when we react to difficult situations in our life, stressful situations, we turn on that fight or flight nervous system that begins to mobilize all of this energy. And what was once very adaptive, like if you were being chased by a lion, thousands of years ago, you'd have to mobilize a lot of energy to either stay and fight or to run. Now, it becomes more complex in our society because you could see a coworker, you could see your mother-in-law.
You could have a bad day.
You could have a bad day.
Yeah.
You could begin to auto-suggest about, problems in your life, and the privilege of being a human being is that we can make thought more real than anything else. And when we do that, we begin to turn on the stress response just by thought alone. And stress is when the body's knocked out of balance. The stress response is what the body does to innately return it back to order. Problem is, if you keep turning on that fight or flight nervous system, that imbalance now becomes the new balance, and now we're headed for disease.
Chronic.
So the stress in the brain causes the forebrain, our rational brain, to turn off, and the hindbrain to begin to secrete all these juices. So what was once very adaptive thousands of years ago becomes very maladaptive, because it's those chemicals of stress that push the genetic buttons that begin to create disease. And if you think about this, we can turn on the stress response just by thought alone. Then by very nature, our thoughts could make us sick. So if our thoughts could make us sick, is it possible that our thoughts could make us well? Just by you thinking about your problems, you begin to turn on the same reaction in your brain and body as if you were being chased by a lion. And that effect then, that begins to knock the body out of balance, begins to turn on this primitive nervous system that begins to secrete a lot of adrenaline and cortisol. And those chemicals, those stress hormones, give the body a rush of energy. You're prepared for an emergency situation. So your pupils dilate, then your salivary juices begin to slow down. You start to get more blood pumping into your body, your heart